Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining us today for our data stewardship discussion. In talking with customers and the community at Data Science Hangouts, we hear a few themes that come up in the questions asked. And regardless of our industries or company sizes, many of us are tackling common problems independently. So I always love getting the opportunity to bring the community together to learn from each other and talk about what's working, what's not, and where we go from here. So today we'll kick off the conversation around the importance of data stewardship at the individual level and what that even means with two community leaders who will draw from their own experience first. I'm so happy to be joined by both Jamie Warner, Managing Director of Data Science and Pricing at Plymouth Rock Assurance, and Dan Boisvert, Head of Data Stewardship at Biogen. There were so many awesome questions submitted ahead of time when y'all RSVP'd. So I've shared these with Jamie and Dan. And after they share a bit about what they're doing in their own organization and from their own experience, we'll jump over to more of a Q&A, open conversation. So please feel free to also ask questions in the chat as well and share your own thoughts too. We want to hear from all of you today. I am also learning from the Hangouts that people really enjoy connecting with other attendees in the chat. So if you are interested in connecting with others, I want to encourage you to say hello in the chat, briefly introduce yourself, your role, where you're based, and something you do for fun. You will notice this session is being recorded, so we'll share it up to the Posit YouTube within the next week. I can also email the recording out to you. I really loved one of the questions or comments that we should have made this a topic of interest to select when registering for PositConf, which is this August in Seattle. So I'm sure we can figure out how to make that happen. But also wanted to use this as an opportunity to share the link to register for Comp. We'd love to see you there. If you're watching as a recording, I'll share any links we mention in the details below. With all that, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love to turn it over to Dan and Jamie to introduce themselves.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Dan Boisvert. I head up a group called Data Stewardship at Biogen. My group's responsible mainly for clinical trial data, thinking about how we use and reuse our data. We also look at data anonymization, external data sharing, imaging ingestion, and data standardization. I also look at a lot at data strategy and work on a project looking at data strategy across research and development.
Awesome. Thank you. And Jamie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jamie Warner. I lead data science pricing for Plymouth Rock Insurance at home, which includes kind of the implementation of our data science models, as well as a lot of our cloud migration, which is pretty exciting. And I also really love doing this stuff after work. So I teach at Northeastern in the data analytics, as well as the HR analytics programs. But super passionate about this. I wish we were big enough to have someone like Dan as a data steward. But I think it'll be nice to see the balance of a company with that infrastructure versus kind of where we have to just pull it from other places.
Thank you both so much for kicking off this conversation today. And I know, Dan, you're going to share a little bit with us first about what data stewardship actually means before we jump into the discussion too.
There you go. And just, a quick disclaimer here is that views that I express are my own and don't necessarily represent those of my company. But I want to talk a little bit about data stewardship here. When I talk about data stewardship, people often ask, is this data governance? Is this data stewardship? What's the difference here? And my joke that I always say is that no one likes data governance. Whether you're an analyst or an executive, everyone thinks it's overkill. It's overhead. We don't need that. Why are you telling me what to do? So very quickly in my journey, I said we need to change how we think about this and really think about this as the individual owners of the data, individual people who work with the data, and how we steward our own information. So this change to data stewardship is really, with that in mind. Internally at Biogen, I run a community of practice around data stewardship, and we did a crowdsourcing exercise last year to come up with what are the best practices. And so what I have on the screen is the best practices that came out of that work. And I'll just talk to it quickly, and I think Jamie can just pop in with some comments as we go through it. I'll start on the left, which is create data that will be used. I know this sounds kind of obvious, But it's really important to know that whatever you're creating as a data scientist or whatever as an analyst is going to be used later on. So you want to leave that in a state where it can be picked up and used. So you want to use well-defined standards, templates, metadata to make sure that whatever you're creating out of the data is able to be picked up and used later on. From there, I can go underneath, which is have clear roles and responsibilities. There's always a little bit of question, a little bit of finger pointing. Is this your job? Is this my job? Is this their job? Who's doing these things? Who's accountable for data access? Who's accountable for standardization of data? And more clarity that you can add here, the better. So I think this is worthwhile to go through and make sure that nothing falls in between the cracks. And then you need to make sure that it's actually resourced, because this is real work. This is hard. This is not someone's passion project. You want to make sure that this is resourced appropriately. With that, I can go into the middle, which is that data should be protected and compliant. So this is thinking a little bit more about data defense. We need to make sure that the data is well protected wherever it's used. And I think this is to make sure, at Biogen, we work with highly sensitive data, but all data that you're going to be working with is going to have some level of sensitivity to it. And you just want to make sure that these permission controls persist as you use the data and perhaps move the data across the org. The one under it is about data compliance. GDPR and then other data privacy protection regulations have come into play. You really need to think about these. How can I use this data? If this is not familiar to you, get familiar with it quickly. Find the person stewarding the data and understand it from them. But there are also maybe more contractual data use agreements that come into play that can really change how data can and cannot be used.
And I love tying that one back to your number one, right? Because if you're creating data that's going to be used, it's a lot easier to protect and make sure you're compliant on smaller volumes of data. So if you know exactly what it's being used for and why you're using it, not just like storing data to store data, it's a lot easier to follow these other guidelines and make sure that you have protected data, especially around like some of the more sensitive data. I know you guys do a lot of medical related data. We have in insurance a lot of like private and PII data, which is personally identifiable information. And so we really have to be careful around it. And one of the ways to be careful is not to store the things you don't need.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that leads nicely into the stuff on the right, which is the single source of truth. Data should be shared in place and trying to be centralized, not like you're saying, have many copies of it all over the place, which is hard to protect and adds, overhead onto it. I do think single source of truth is a little bit of an aspirational goal. I think it's kind of our intention of where we're going. But there are technical limitations, there are departmental limitations that require different copies of data to be made. And there's just some sort of pragmatism that we have to take when we think about this. And the last one is to consider producers and consumers of data. I do think as data users, we often think we're at the end of the line, like all the data gets generated, cleaned, created, and then it comes to us. And then we do something and that's it. But I think we should make sure that we know that we're in the middle of the line. So like there's someone who produces something that we use, that we consume, but we produce something that someone else consumes. So I think when you understand this, that you're in the middle and not at the end, you start thinking about the data that you produce and how to make sure that it's used by the people downstream from you, and how are you a better partner to what's being done upstream from you.
Yeah, I love that, especially because I think people are going to do what people are going to do. So it's more effective to meet them where they are sometimes and realize that they're actually going to do these things with your data and figure out the best way you can manage that and keep aware of it, rather than just saying no and then they go and they do it anyway, in a less effective, less documented way. So I also love that kind of idea of creating like the clear roles and responsibilities, but also creating like a toolkit around like, let's make sure this is documented. Let's make it easy for you to do this work. Let's make it easy for you to tell me what you're doing, or make sure that I understand exactly where this data is going and how you're using it, so I can enable you rather than kind of trying to cut it off, which has the opposite effect frequently.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot about what's possible when you know what's there. And if you don't know what's there, you like abnormally constrict yourself. So just even knowing stuff is there, knowing who your consumers are, knowing who your producers are, having conversations with them, starting to learn about what's there, what information they have, how you can start accessing it. I think that starts breeding some innovative thought.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I know I mentioned earlier there were so many questions that were submitted ahead of time when people RSVP'd. So I can kick us off with a few of those there. But again, encourage you all to put questions into the chat as well. We want to make this a discussion with the community. But one of the first questions was, how do you effectively communicate data management standards to your team? And how do you engage with teams that are resistant to change? And Jamie, I'd love to have you start off with this one.
Sure. I think the easiest way to do that is to make the change as easy as possible for them, right? And the way that I like to do that is make a toolkit or make a framework, right? If you have a really easy tool to document things, like giving them that, even if it's something as simple as an Excel, like kind of meeting them where you are versus getting the best possible tool. But in a lot of ways, to me, the reason people resist change in a lot of circumstances seems to not be because they don't want to change or they don't see the value. It seems to be a lot more around, I have a lot of other things to do, and this is the worst thing on my list, and it's not going to help me. It's going to help someone else later. So, giving them tools that make it really easy for them to document or make it really easy for them to share, or even if it's just having a common storage location where you can go find it later and deal with it, I think really helps along the process. And that to me has gotten a lot further than trying to really get people to rethink the way that they work, which is a much longer term, harder thing to transition through. But you can do it a lot, especially when there's new hires, kind of teaching them that as you bring them in. I'm curious, Dan, kind of with a bigger organization, how do you guys think about that?
Oh, that's great. I think you're really hitting on the key points here. Um, Often when you see resistance to change, people don't know what you're asking them to do. So I think the stuff that you're saying is like, just do this. Like you give them something, just fill out this form. And that is much, much easier than saying, be a better data steward, right? And that does not evoke change. Um, but as I do get further in my career, I think about trying to make change in the organizations, and change is very, very hard. So let's make sure that when we are making change, that there is a value statement behind it, and that we keep bringing that back up to help people really tie what they're doing back to what value they're creating out of it. There is this change management framework that I really like. It's from this book called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, and they have a nice picture about how change happens, which is you have an elephant, and then you have someone riding the elephant, and then the elephant is on a path. So the elephant is the emotional mind. This is like how you feel about things, and the rider is your rational mind, and then the path is, how you actually get there. So I think what Jamie was talking about is the path. You got to make the path really easy for the elephant to plod along on. But you have to, and you can talk to the rational mind and saying, these things are important. This is a GDPR requirement. You have to do this. I'll show you the statistics of why this is more effective. But the rider on the elephant, he gets tired of pulling the elephant at some point, and eventually the elephant just goes down the path. So you do have to affect that emotional mind too, and then make the path really easy. So your best bet is when the elephant just goes and the path is just obvious for them. But when you're trying to steer the elephant into a new direction, you have to think about the rational, the emotional, and the path, and try to move that forward.
And Dan, I know you just mentioned GDPR there, and I remember, Jamie, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that people need to recognize that it's a problem as well, and like showing the pain of the actual issue. I was wondering if you had any other thoughts on that too.
I mean, I think one of the biggest data transformations I've ever seen came from California's right to be forgotten law, where companies had to be able to get rid of all record of someone. You could go and you could request to the company in California, hey, I don't want to be in your data anymore. And one of the big challenges for companies was they actually couldn't connect a record across all their different systems. And that was a financial and otherwise legal incentive where they actually had to make these huge transformations in the data systems to make that feasible. Now, those transformations actually enabled all their systems. It enabled things like AI. If you want to do that, you have to have your systems connected effectively. But none of those things are usually incentive enough to go through one of those massive transformations. They're expensive. They're really hard to do. The historic data is really hard to mess with. And so I think finding some of those legal things that are starting to come out now, especially around all this governance. I know a lot of folks are like, oh no, governance, but I'm actually really excited about some of the stuff that's coming out because I think it's a great way to give an incentive. People seem really excited about, investing in data science or investing in AI, but they seem much less excited in investing in the core systems that actually make that all possible, which are much more tedious, much more expensive, and are what is actually going to push us forward. And so I know Dan has to deal with that every day. I'm curious if he thinks about other incentives, but for me, like those kind of legal types of boundaries that they're putting in place actually really give us an incentive to fix those systems and make it a lot easier that we don't have haphazard pipelines from here and there and everywhere trying to connect data. And that's really how we get a lot of issues with definitions or understanding where something came from or using something that was created. A lot of that secondary data usage where you're using it for one purpose, it was created for a different one, and you didn't realize the definition was a little bit different.
Yeah, no, this is great. I do think the regulations push us forward, and there's a lot of complaints for sure when these regulations come out that we have to abide to. But I do think that they move us forward in a good direction, and I think they do have that strategic mindset in place, like you're saying, where this actually helped us in the long term because it connected all these systems where we never would have been in this place before. One of the things that in that change management thing is you need to solve a problem. You need to solve a problem that actually exists, and you need to solve a problem that is recognized to exist. So GDPR is a great one. Here's this new law. Are you compliant to GDPR? Like, have we ever heard of GDPR before? No. So like it's a clear problem, right, to be able to go implement it. And I think as you look across all different problems like this, the more you can bring visibility to the issue, you could start to feel the pain a little, show the pain to the organization. That's where you start to get people to adjust their mindset and say, this is a problem. I see this as a problem. We need to change this. We need to change this. And you could start moving the organization forward like that.
We had a bit of an issue with the recording the first go around. So you'll notice that for the first part here, all of a sudden we have different lighting, different shirts, or different hairstyles. So if you're wondering why, that's why. I see there was a question that came into the chat a little bit. Oh, and real quickly, can you share a reference to that book again? What was it?
Oh, sure. It's called Switch. Hey, Chris, I'll put it in the.
I see, Timothy, you had a question in the chat a little bit earlier. Do you want to jump in here, introduce yourself, and ask that?
Hey, everybody. Thanks a lot. I'm Tim York. I'm at Virginia Commonwealth University, professor there. I was wondering, we run into this problem a lot. We store a lot of data. Are there guidelines, standards for the minimally reported information that must accompany a data set? Are there accepted standards out there that are published?
I don't know of one. That would be amazing, right?
No.
I think we're all trying to figure out what good is, right? Like what's the minimum good that we should just abide by? Like I'd kind of ask that back to everyone on the team on the call here. Is there some set of metadata, some set of general standards around it?
I would say maybe just quickly, since you mentioned you're at a university, what your IRB has in that's a really good place. So the Internal Review Board for Research. So those are for folks not used to university systems, the folks that approve research, they also typically have some data guidelines around what you're allowed to store, how you're allowed to store it, things like that. So that's a good place to start. In insurance, we have really strict regs. So by industry, like what we're allowed to store about people, how long we're allowed to use it, things like that. I'm curious. So yeah, like what Dan said, if anyone else I don't see anyone in the chat that's jumping for joy on this one, but any other folks that have experience with some standards?
And also, if you want to jump in, you can raise your hand on Zoom. So if you see the reactions bar below, if you click that, it will let you raise your hand too.
So in academics, we typically try to store a code book along with the data and also meet all of our IRB regulations in terms of security on where to store the data. But outside of that, I was just curious if there's any other kind of information per data sets that you guys always associate with the data.
Yeah, like I think you're saying like a data dictionary or code book is probably what you're calling it.
Yeah. I mean, I think a
Like
couple of the
who's the
things,
owner, who
yeah.
should it be direct, who has permission, like you're talking about, who has ownership of the data, who has permissions to do X, Y, and Z, who is ultimately responsible for the data. You know, I guess those types of sort of metadata that should always travel with the data.
Yeah, I think there's actually reasonably good research out on those sorts of high level topics. And so, and a few of the different like data framework um, that exist have those. A lot of times we like to think about kind of like, I think for a while there were like the 5 V's of the data, but like that's kind of moved on. But I like to think about like where did it come from? What was its intended use? So is it primary or secondary initially? And then who created it? At what time did they create it? What time scale does it go over is a really big one. Because a lot of times you can kind of think about how things will be changing over time. And I think I'd have to pull up a resource. There's a couple of resources I can put one as a follow-up that do have like broad guidelines for what sort of information at that high level you should be keeping. But really time, location, and any sort of like discrepancies or known potential issues. And then the reason you sourced it is the biggest one because like going back to Dan's slide, I think it's really interesting to say we have a single source of the truth because at a lot of companies, different departments will consider a different calculation the same source of the truth. So if you think about like finance and actuarial, or maybe even within finance, they'll have a few different definitions of the same term sometimes. And so if you don't know why that data was being used originally, you don't know which definition it's going to be. And I presume that's for your type of research as well, if another professor wants to go pick it up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think you could. Only one I would add to Jamie's list there is who can use it. I think sometimes we have data where anyone can use it. Sometimes we have data that has a very limited data use agreement, and so we need to restrict it. And so a little bit of that knowledge up front. We were just talking about this, like having some sort of data list that has like, what the data set is, who to contact about it, what the data set means, and where it is, and who can use it is a pretty good first pass. And then I think you want to get into like what you were talking about there, like what do the individual columns in the data set mean? What do the individual values mean? Well, how can you add, and then you could kind of just snowball from there of like how far you want to go.
Matthew, I see your hands raised. Want to jump in here?
Yeah, so just to do a quick intro, I head enterprise data and AI services. So I report to the CTO. I'm an IT side, so responsible for anything about data and AI within the global organization. I'm in insurance. And so I think that which probably one of my favorite answers right now is that, well, it depends because it really has to depending on where you are. Are you a global company? Are you a regional company? Are you someone who's in a specific state who has certain laws or whatnot? Also, what industry you're in. In pharmaceuticals, I used to work for Boisvert as well, and we have a lot more rules on what it needs to use to define a data set versus when I was at working at a college. So it very depends on where you are. So that's why you won't really find a general set of requirements, but rather suggestions. And so you see here everyone commenting that here are the things you can look at and whatnot. But all this all comes from a data governance practice. So ideally, there should be, and I say ideally because I don't think it happens everywhere, but there should be a data governance group of folks within a organization, a community, a set of people that help define what this is. And that is going to be definition that you're going to be using going forward. So I know some folks mentioned that in universities, there is a document out there that kind of defines what that is. And so that my assumption is that there is some type of data governance people together defining that. But in reality, it really depends on who you are, where you are, and how large the organization is. So unfortunately, it's one of those answers that I get once in a while that it does depend.
Thank you. I'll jump over to the next question here, and I get the feeling that we could have an all-day conference on this topic, considering we just did one question there. But the other one was, what do you think of the idea that data governance should be rebranded as data enablement?
I have strong views here. If you want me to go first, Jamie. So my strong view here is that there's no one on this call who likes data governance. Like even I think when you talk to the people who do data governance professionally, they're like, yeah, but it's not really, like they try to talk themselves out of it. There's something with the word governance that just holds a lot of baggage for people. Oh, you're going to tell me how to do my work? I'm the analyst. I know I'm the data scientist here. You're going to tell me what I can do without my data. So I saw that really early in this journey, and I immediately rebranded it to data stewardship because of this baggage that's there. And I think what's happening on our data ecosystems is that we used to be all centralized, right? It was like centralized. And then you could reasonably have a centralized data governance over it. But what happens over time is it all spreads out, right? And now we're managing the mesh, right? And when you manage the mesh, you need people at the individual points of it to manage it. And so I think that's where you get more of a view of a data stewardship. You're kind of accountable for your little node of the mesh. So if we were to go that further and say, call it data enablement, I guess my point here is we're on that journey for sure. And data enablement to me is a little too soft of a term. But I think it could be something that is like pointing us towards we are generating value. I think that's what it's trying to say. We are generating value through this work. This is not busy work just to overly restrict you.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it depends on who I'm talking to. So for senior leadership, I think the idea of data governance is really just it's expensive, it gets in the way. And so data enablement to me is a great little advertising catchphrase to get us where we need to go and what we need investment wise. But also, I do think it's important to have really frank governance conversations with data scientists, data engineers, et cetera, and use that terminology to be really frank about the fact that this is something that's important that we have to care about. And this is something that is critical to the work that you do. And so to me, the branding is more how we fund it, how we enable it. And the actual terminology is, I think, sometimes we don't want to be, like Dan said, soft when we get down to actually brass tacks of fixing the data and cleaning the data and understanding the data. And I think a lot of that I feel like can tie back to what makes a good data engineer or data scientist, which is curiosity, in my opinion. And so if you're curious about your data, you're actually going to be doing data governance as you go through it, right? You're going to be asking questions about what looks weird, how is this defined, do I understand this? And so you being really good at the governance piece is you being really good at your piece of the work as well.
Thank you. Another question that was asked ahead of time was, it's easy in theory that the organization should have a single source of truth of data, but in reality, each org has their own definition of measures and metrics. and what to track under the same name. How do we overcome that? And I'll copy the question over into the chat too.
I went first the last two times, Jamie.
Sure. So I think this is actually something that we should embrace a little more. And I don't know, Dan, if you're gonna knock my lights out for saying that, but it is really important that different definitions exist in different environments. The question is, how do we tie it all together? And so I think that organizations where they say you can only get data from here and you can only get it in this way end up with a lot of shadow IT departments or shadow servers or shadow data that's been downloaded and massaged. If instead we say, we know we have different definitions for this, how do we integrate this into our systems? That ends up with a much better outcome where people actually get what they need, which goes back to that first point Dan had on his first slide. Like, why are we creating this resource to begin with? And I think sometimes in the act of governing and setting things up and doing all this work, we forget why we started pulling the data together in the first place, which is usability and functionality. And so in this, I would encourage that, and I would encourage them to write the definition down. And then we start having our governance, right? So you want data a certain way? Yeah, let's do it. Let's write it down. Let's get it framed. Let's make sure we have really clear documentation and definitions. And then let's move forward with your department has a slightly different definition than this department, and that's okay. It's in a different layer or it's in a different view or whatever, however you want to set it up. So I actually really think this is a good thing. And something that should be encouraged because it is the reality of the way we work.
How can you disagree with that, Jamie? Well, I think Jamie said it really, really well. But there's just some reality here. People are going to go do their jobs whether you like it or not. And so when those, but I guess I'm a big proponent not to create a process where the only way to get your job done is to break the process, right? So you need to kind of live in reality here of, okay, so we're going to create these different things are going to exist. How do we just know that they all exist? How do we protect them all? There is a little bit of overhead every time you do create something. So, and there's also a little bit of risk if we have two things that look the same, but they're a little bit different, and people think that they're the same. That's where we could get into some kind of trickier situations that are hard to deal with. I'm thinking back, this is a while now, but I did some work about looking at semantic web, and they have this idea of collaboration without coordination. So that there's a way to collaborate and kind of use the same data, but kind of at a meta level, connect it all together. And I think that's a really nice way to think about it because people will kind of be pulling the data out into their individual nodes, into their individual pockets. But can we, at this higher meta or semantic level, connect that data together so that we can manage it a little bit better? But that's my thoughts there.
Matthew, I see you had some thoughts on the thread there in the chat. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so when I started at this organization, we just moved off of the prim world, and so moving on to cloud services. And so there was no defined enterprise data architecture. It was just a glob of different applications, and they had some integration pipelines to connect them. And so the way that we moved forward was coming out, well, of course, with executive leadership and support from the engineers, that we came up with a defined enterprise data architecture and a strategy on how to get there. And you build that roadmap and include everyone into that to get the alignment to that. That's how you move towards to something like that. So the one I mentioned here was a medallion architecture. So we do use Databricks and daily. And so we show on how does it work from a general perspective, meaning that if I have external or data I want to bring in from applications, well, you have a raw layer. That's where everything comes in. No one manipulates, no one does anything to it. Then you mature it and bring it to a common data model. So, and then I think you mentioned earlier that every data should have a purpose or a reason to use it. And so the reason for us in this common data model is to provide the business with a data set that has generally all use cases available to it because it's the common data model, not anything for specific use, but specific to commonality that's out there. Then you build separate data sets coming from that to be the ones that are specific for a given report or for given analytics purposes or whatnot. So then you can track down from lineage to the source of truth, which is our raw layer. So if someone's able to come to articulate that and be able to explain this at many different levels, then you can get this body of people who kind of support it and want to go in that direction. And so that's where now we are actually in this journey, moving everything to this enterprise data architecture. But again, there's a lot of effort to do that. But that's one coming out with that document is going to be one of the biggest achievements.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's kind of showing the path on the change management. If you could say like, because right now people are probably just landing their data wherever and then doing something with it. But if you could say, look, land it here, and then all this stuff automatically happens to it, all this stuff automatically propagates it into silver, into gold, it makes it there. Like that change management, I think it'll always be a little bit because you're taking the control away from the people on the ground. There's always going to be a little rub there. But I think if you really show that pathway, this is the easy way to go. This is the way the organization is going. So just drop your data over here. I think that's a great way to go.
Yep.
I think this question is really related to the one that we just discussed, but what is your advice on how to reduce duplicate data stewardship? Maybe when it's not already at this org-wide level, when multiple people are consistently making similar data transformations for similar work.
I would first ask why. To me, that's always the first question is when you see something like that, why is it happening? And if it's actually duplicative, I think that's actually more of an HR problem you're going to have to deal with, right? Of do these two roles still need to exist, and are these legacy processes that are just happening because somebody needed them at one point and you can't combine them across. So to me, sometimes it's not a data problem, it's a organizational structure problem. And we see that a lot when companies are, especially like insurers, we see that a lot. We buy books of business and we absorb different pieces of companies. And so you'll realize suddenly, oh, this person pulls the same report as this person. So like, do they both need to pull that report is my first question before I even try to do it as a data focused question. If the reason is, well, I define this a little bit differently than they define this, then that's a great time to document how they're defined differently and rename them separately. And to me, that's kind of the first start of where I would handle that. The second piece is, I think, though it's really great at a larger firm when you can get kind of to where Matthew was describing, like, we're going to put the data here and we're going to flow it through. I think in the meantime, you can push out tools and requirements to people where they are that meet them where they are. So if they start documenting their data, it's a lot easier to do that ingestion process, because one of the biggest places I see a lot of this fail is when IT or someone tries to start pulling everything in and they don't have the business buy-in, they don't get the definitions from the business. And then when it comes to being usable, the CEO is like, your number is different than my people's number. I'm just going to use my people's number. And that kind of like turns into a big issue. So part of a big piece of it to me is, why do they need it? Why are they using it? And then can we shut it off too? Is always a question for me of like, does anyone actually read this dashboard? Like maybe they're both pulling it, creating something and nobody uses it. It's just something we've always done. So that happens a lot. Dan, I don't know if that happens as much to you as it happens to me, but
Oh, I like that. I think it's a really pragmatic answer. The way my brain went on this one is big organizations, right hand to the left hand, don't always know what they're doing, right? So you may, I think this could easily happen, and we see it a lot. People in this group are doing this thing, and then people in this other group who never talk to each other, right, are doing this other thing, and turns out the first like 8 steps of it are exactly the same. So here I'm going to say talk, get some organization to be able to, you should be able to at least grab a list of who has access to the data, right? And maybe just have those people come together a little bit once a month, once a quarter to be like, hey, this is what we do with the data. What do you do with the data? And just to start getting people together a little bit, because I do believe that no one wants to do duplicative work. Like if like I feel like as like software engineers, growing up through this, where like if someone's already done it, I'm just going to take it and then go from there, right? I don't need to like redo these calculations that are already done. So I think there's some opportunity for collaboration there, and then just see what makes sense. Because sometimes it is duplicative and it can be shut off, like Jamie's saying, and sometimes it's not really, and it doesn't work just because of the reality of our systems and how we work.
Yeah, that was going to be my own follow-up question there. Is like, how do you know when somebody else is doing the same work as you somewhere else in the organization?
Rach, I feel like this is kind of what you do with these meetups. Is if you're in your organization and you're a data scientist, you should know the other data scientists. If you do BI work, you should know the other people that do BI. If nothing else, in case your department gets shuttered and you need somewhere else to go at a minimum, which we're seeing a lot in the industry lately. But at a maximum, like knowing what the other people that do your type of role across the company do is really important, and kind of setting up those informational interviews, those coffees can help you not just with your data, but with your career. And it can also create a situation where the first time you're coming to someone isn't, hey, we make the same thing and it's a little bit threatening. It's more, oh, we've already talked about this. I didn't realize you guys did that, but cool. We also do that. So I would really recommend making sure you have a community. A lot of companies do have like, little mini groups. I know for us, we have a monthly meetup of the folks using certain data tools that we talk through what we're all working on. And that really helps us feel like a team effort to get these things slowed down and pulled together rather than just like, oh, randomly one day you get an email that someone says the thing you're doing you shouldn't be doing, which I think can go a long way, but also is really beneficial to your own experience, and the work they're doing might help inform other work you're doing. So I'd say a lot of that is building that community before and thinking about being part of that community.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just want to double down on that for community organizers who may be on the call. I know a big question for community organizers is like, how do we show the value of this community to our organization? And like what Jamie just said right there, that's such a great point, an example that you could pull from. Chris, I see you just put a question in the chat. Want to jump in here? We can't hear you yet. You might still be muted. I can read it if you want. And if you want to just add some context or jump in after, let me know. But the question was, would it be in the scope of this meeting to talk about possible tools that could facilitate data governance? Would something like a Git for data address some of these issues?
You want me to go?
Yeah, you can start.
I have a vague answer. Hi, Chris. Nice to hear from you. Um, I'm kind of split on tools here. There are tools. You could look at their data cataloging tools, their data governance tools. You could Google this and find a whole list of them. And I'd be interested actually for people on the phone if they're using things like this, how it's going. For me, the need really has to be there. And the organization really has to see, the people doing the work really have to see the need for it. Because I see way too many of these, let's implement this data governance tool, and then nobody in the organization thinks it's necessary, and then they don't use it, and then you just wasted a whole bunch of time and money on it. So I think you need to do a lot of work on generating the need, generating people to do it. It's got to be, you have to start implementing those tools at a point where people can't do it by themselves anymore, and they want this automation, and they need this automation so that they can do it. But to go from it's kind of a mess right now to let's put in whatever data governance tool you want is too much of a jump, I think, for people.
Yeah, I would add that I did pop one recent like startup that I've seen that's kind of trying to do this. But again, one of the things I've talked to them about is I don't know what your business case is. Like, why do we buy you? Because it's just a cost center. And so kind of leading off on what Dan was saying, it is kind of one of the things I'm seeing with a lot of the AI tools is that it's kind of getting integrated. So it's almost like you don't need your own solution. There's a lot more integration, it seems like, across different platforms that we're using where they're adding in features that allow you to better govern your data as you work with your data in different tools like a Databricks or something else. Like a lot of these tools, Data Robot didn't have like data cleaning and data ingestion layers before and have added them over the years. Not saying they're good. I don't want to advertise those particular ones, but we are seeing a lot more stuff around like the legacy of your data, kind of the lineage of your data, all that information becoming more populated in a lot of these tools and becoming more visually available. So when I think about things you need to know about your data to understand it, like the distributions and other things, a lot of tools are making it much easier to look at that. So it's almost less important that you're as good as it at the front if you are able to check it really easily versus having to do a lot of work to check it. So I'd be curious how the environment evolves over the next couple of years because it feels like a lot of company like tools that we're using for other parts of the process, like ML workflows, are starting to integrate that first section of like, oh wait, the data is actually important. It's the core of everything we do. So, and I don't know, Dan, if at scale you're seeing those types of tools be useful. I can see how they'd be useful in a smaller group like mine, but maybe for all of Biogen, a little bit more difficult.
Like you, I'm waiting. I think it'll evolve in the next couple of years a little bit better.
Matthew, I see your hand raised. Jump in.
Yeah, so Dan, I think I agree with you for normally for any other tool but data governance tool, because no one in general is going to want to fund a data governance tool unless a big data challenge happened that cost a company a lot of money. It's one of those, and creating a need is also, at least I felt in my experience, was a challenge because again, who wants to add additional work to themselves? So the way I went about it was let's bring the tool in first, because the first question you're going to get when you talk about data governance is, well, how are we going to do it? What tools do we have? And how much work is it going to give me? And my response is, well, we haven't found a tool yet, but we do need data governance. Would not work very well. So since we utilize Azure much for our cloud, the tool for us made sense was Azure Purview, and more because it's Azure, but also because it has integrations with many other Azure services. And so bringing that tool first in, then building a data governance practice around that tool worked for our direction, again, because we don't have to deal with let's look at all the different platform tools out there and try to select one, and who's going to give us a budget to do that, who's going to then benefit from that budget conversation. So I think sometimes in rare occasions, the tool first works, but I do say that I do agree again with you for any other tool out there, you need to try the need. But I think data governance is one of those that it's kind of the chicken first before the egg.
Yeah, and it might be, when we say data governance, what do we mean exactly on it? There's probably some high risk stuff that we don't really appreciate at the ground level that needs some control and that we just can't. You're not going to find a business case for it, that there's not going to be positive ROI for it, but still has to be done. Yeah. And I mean, maybe you could argue that the need exists already there, but it's just not well seen across the organization. But I could see that for some like overarching kind of approaches.
This is also a place where I love to go to see what regulators are up to. So I think some of the biggest drives in insurance that I've seen in terms of data cleanup have been from things like the California right to be forgotten laws. So for example, the purpose of that law is that if they come to you, you have to be able to delete all their data records. So that means you have to be able to effectively connect all their data records across the org. And that is a great justification for data enhancement and data tools in a way that is something that's very real that the company is facing. And we're seeing a lot more stuff coming from the White House and from other places, and even internationally, even more aggressively in Europe, I would say, around some of these data governments or data requirements or right to be able to see your data and the information behind it. And a lot of that to me is also where we're getting some justification for spend in this space is, hey, we're going to get hit with this in the next 2 years. Let's not get fined at the start. Let's have this ready. And that to me kind of sometimes resonates a little bit more as well if we're trying to get these tools in place. The challenge to me is there isn't a great tool. I know like even Informatica, which is built just really for that, to me is a nightmare. But maybe I shouldn't say that on a call. An unnamed tool is a nightmare, but I haven't seen like a great one either. And maybe that's because it's so hard to sell in this space historically. But it's definitely a challenge on that front too, of like, what's a good tool? I can't like think of one off the top of my head that I'm like, I would definitely get that one if I had all the money for it.
Yeah, I think it's maybe for the software companies, it's hard for them to position it as we change from this centralized governance to this mesh governance. And like the users of it are more like data scientists and data engineers and not like IT DBAs, stuff like that. And I think maybe that hasn't caught up yet in the software, but I agree with you, not necessarily to call out specific companies here.
Yeah, I think, as you said, regulatory is changing a lot, right? Seeing a huge influx the last 5 or 6 years and more requirements. And it used to be all about applications and governance on the applications, but now it's on the data. And now with AI as well, the same thing. AI is a data generating machine. So we're going to be seeing a lot more of it.
I didn't know if we were going to go the tool direction in the conversation today, but I feel like I should add in here. I know a lot of our closet customers also work with Databricks for governance, regardless of if we're using the term governance or stewardship. And I just wanted to use the opportunity to add that I know a few of our team members are going to be at the summit in a few weeks. And so I unfortunately won't be there, but they're planning a few like in-person customer events. So while this crew is here, I just wanted to let people know that that event is happening if you want to meet with the team there. This hour is going by very quickly. Let me jump over to one of the questions was, what resources beyond this session could I use to learn more about data stewardship? Doesn't need to be an ongoing or updated resource, but books would be fine too.
See, I think there's this a data management book of knowledge called DMBOK. That's probably worth a read. I do think conversations like this and conversations with other people are very helpful. I don't know that this is I don't think there are a lot of data stewardship books out there. I feel like this is kind of an emerging area. So I think a lot of the knowledge you'll get from your colleagues. But I'd love to see if people have stuff, maybe just drop it in the chat of where you've learned through this.
Yeah, I would second that one. I also pasted an O'Reilly chapter up above that's just like a high level overview, quick fun read right before bed. Want to go to sleep. But I do also think one of the places you can look is ethics. So AI ethics and stuff like that is an exploding space right now, and there's a lot that actually ties back to the governance of the data. So to me, that's also a good kind of stream to follow. There's tons of different really good resources on that. And even locally, we have coded bias kind of type of work, and that talks a lot about data, and it can help you think about how to think about governance when you think about the bias it can create further down the pipeline. So I think that might also be a helpful place when there isn't a lot of great resource at the ground level.
And you can reach out. I guess you could always reach out to me, and I'm sure to Jamie too. We're happy to.
Yeah, that too. We're happy to chat.
Happy to share or commiserate together.
Yeah.
Maybe there's the case for future data stewardship conversations as well, considering I think there are 70 questions a minute.
Well, and I think that's kind of the exciting thing about everybody being on the call is I know when we first talked to Rachel about this, we were like, maybe 10 to 12 people want to chat about this problem that we have constantly in this space. And there's a couple hundred. So that's awesome and exciting and curious how all of us together can come up with a much better solution than what we have today.
Absolutely. So I will take that on as a potential action item from this first call is to look at what future conversations can we have about this topic too. But really appreciate to hear in the chat other resources that you all turn to as well. Jamie or Dan, were there any, I know I shared a bunch of the questions with you ahead of time. Was there anything you thought was going to come up today that we didn't get a chance to talk about? And I'll ask anybody who, if I missed your question and you're on right now, if you want to
There,
raise your hand.
yeah, there was one I really liked that asked about data that changes over time and definitions that change over time. Um, and how to deal with that. And I think and they asked it as if it was a very unique question. But I think it's actually a very common question. And a big piece of kind of how to think about the structure of your data and if you can create flexibility where you can change terminology and still have it match and map. And a lot of that's like a documentation tagging kind of scenario. So I was really excited and interested about that one and just wanted to call out that that's a very common issue. And also, you can create a framework for your data where if the name of something is changing, you can still have it linked back to the historical names. And I think that's something that's important to know. I know we don't have time to dive into the logistics of it, but I don't know, Dan, if you have additional comments on that one, but that one really caught my eye.
Yeah, that one was interesting because they're like, I managed data over like 50 years or something like that. And over the 50 years, it changes. Maybe I'm the only one who has this problem. And we're all like, no, everyone has this problem. Um, the, it's a longer conversation for sure. My gut is to always say, be pragmatic here and understand there is a reality. It does change. We have something with like vendors, and vendors get bought by other companies, and we're trying to match. We have the name of the old company, and then they don't exist anymore, but it's the new company. It's how do you manage that over time? It is challenging, and you need standards, you need process to be able to do that. But you just need to make some decisions too. Say, we're no longer doing it like that. We're doing it like this now, because otherwise you just get stuck in this gray area where no one can go forward, and everyone's doing stuff a little bit differently.
Ties back nicely to your first point of why are we using this? And I say that as someone who uses 50 years of data back when I was in life insurance, but there's always the question of, is this part of the business still relevant? Is this historical name still relevant? Do we still need this? And sometimes it's hard to realize that when you're in the thick of fixing the data.
Well, I know we're at the top of the hour here, so I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us today and for all the great questions that were submitted ahead of time and also brought up live. I am committing to some sort of follow-up blog post with some of this Q&A once I go through the recording. I know part of the recording, something happened in the beginning, so maybe, Dan, I can chat with you after about just re-recording this intro slide. But a huge thank you to you, Jamie and Dan, for joining us. I'm so grateful to leaders like you who are willing to open up and share your experience with all of us.